Initiative.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The GlobalSouth network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
GlobalSouth network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and collaboration, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN. The GlobalSouth Network is a much admired initiative.
كانت جزء لا يتجزأ من الدولة العثمانية.
We are being criticized for doing our job and for upholding the federal constitution. Like I have said in the past, I will not bend to such lame pressures and insinuations.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, civil society, legal community, etc.
Quiero expresar mi sincero agradecimiento al Dr. Nauman Riad.
Dr. Nauman Riad, the founder and convener of the GlobalSouth Network. His visionary leadership has established a vibrant forum where judges, academics, and practitioners from around the world can share and exchange ideas.
I would like to point out that Dr. Riad's initiatives have not only enriched comparative judicial dialogue, have also fostered mutual understanding of the diverse challenges that courts face in safeguarding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
We can rule when we want in the cases which are brought to us by citizens.
After all, what would you do as a colonizer from the global north, conditioned by a systemic othering mindset and driven by economic lust built on commodification, including the commodification of human beings?
So good afternoon to those of you tuning in from the UK or Europe. Good morning in America. Thanks again to Nauman Riad, and apologies to everyone whose names I am about to massacre. Nauman is a lecturer in law at Leicester Law School and founder and convener of the GlobalSouth Network. So we are grateful to him for convening the events today and the entire program of weekly seminars. I'm Leonid Sirota. I'm an associate professor at the Reading Law School. Before Reading, I taught in New Zealand, and I teach public law at Reading. My research is concerned with various public law areas, including constitutional interpretation, administrative law, and a number of others I'm not going to bore you with. It is a pleasure to chair the GlobalSouth Network PhD in Progress session today. I'm looking forward to the discussion, for which I am joined by a discussant and two peer commentators today. Our discussant is Dr. Marcus de Matos, and he is a senior lecturer in public and international law. His research interests revolve around public law, legal theory, law and humanities, human rights, and public policy. His research offers an innovative approach to the notion of sovereignty, moving beyond the indeterminacy and agonism of legal and state forms to demonstrate the limits and links between modern law and the aesthetic construction of the subject. Our peer commentators today are first Kevin James. He's a PhD student at University College of London. And his doctoral research looks at federalism through the lens of constitutional theory and comparative constitutional law. It explores the normative potential of federalism in fostering more inclusive, plural, and resilient constitutional orders in post-colonial settings, such as in South Asia. He did his LLM at Harvard and received the Dean's Prize in American Legal History there. And he has a BA LLB from the Hidayatullah National Law University in India, where he received a gold medal in jurisprudence and legal methods. And our second commentator today is Harry Imlack. He's a PhD candidate at Sheffield. He did his LLM in Nottingham. His PhD research concerns constitutional change in the UK, and he's more broadly interested in UK public law, constitutional law, and constitutional theory. Last but not least, I am now able to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Hernán Gómez Yuri, who is a juridical science doctor candidate at Yale Law School and Land Steiermark fellow at the Revi Universität in Graz, Austria. He obtained his LLM degree from Yale, is a Fulbright scholar, and has an LLB from the University of Chile, where he served as a teaching assistant in the fields of legal theory, critical legal theory, and moral philosophy. He also worked as research assistant for the Chilean National Research Fund for Science and Technology, working on the rights of people with disabilities and co-authoring pieces on issues such as autonomy, supported decision-making, and voting rights. So today, Hernán will present a part of his PhD project entitled Guarantor'S Puzzle. He will speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have comments from our discussants. Time permitting, hopefully we'll also be able to have some questions from the audience after that. So Hernán, the floor is yours.
I want to thank Norman in the network for putting all of this together. Such an enormous and fantastic work that you're doing. Thank the discussant, the commentators, and the chair for the session. And I want to begin saying a few words as a matter of context of what you're about to hear and see. This is my first attempt to put into writing an intuition regarding what can become the theoretical framework of a comparative study of guarantor fourth branch institutions in Latin America in particular. Is something that is I am just in an initial stage, so I have not even discussed it with my supervisor yet. You will be probably one of a few of the first persons to comment on this. So I will appreciate very much if you can help me to spot the gaps in the argument that I will be developing. So without further ado, if you can begin presenting. So the subject of my research, as I was saying, has to do with these independent institutions that have proliferated in many constitutions worldwide and that have been labeled with several different names, such as guarantors, integrity branch, institutions for protecting democracy, and new efferate counterpowers, among others. But concretely, these are very heterogeneous institutions that include managed electoral management bodies, supreme audit institutions, independent criminal prosecutors, central banks, constitutional and judicial councils, and although a little bit more controversial, also constitutional courts, from my point of view at least. And what I think that all these institutions have in common is something that was mentioned by Tarun Kaitan in his proposal of guarantor institutions, which is that they all realize a non-self-enforcing norm, a non-self-enforcing function that puts them at odds with powerful political interest. I mostly speak about a guarantor model or guarantors in a broad sense because if you are familiar with Professor Kaitan's work, I don't entirely agree with the whole proposal of the features that identify a guarantor institution from his point of view. As the title suggests, if these institutions are to enforce a null self-enforcing function that conceptually integrates the possibility of colliding with powerful organized interest in the political branches, that generates a puzzle. First, a puzzle regarding why these institutions are created in the first place, but then how these institutions, once in place, can remain being independent and effective against this powerful interest. And that puzzle has led some authors to be more skeptic than others regarding their potential. So, for example, you'll see that Mark Tashnet, that writes a whole book about the fourth branch, begins saying, particularly regarding constitutional courts, that the conditions that allow one of these institutions to protect democracy are exactly the conditions where these institutions are not even needed. In other words, these institutions can protect democracy when the political process is more or less functional already. So my proposal is that under certain conditions, these institutions will not be superfluous solutions. They can make a difference. And the task of this theoretical framework is to identify those conditions, because eventually when you, in the next step of the research, I will be able to observe, to isolate and to identify in the ground whether these conditions can be observed or not, and if they have a predictive power over the success or failure of the guarantor model. I will skip the first part of this, but in a relatively functional democracy, you would expect that some functions will be self-enforcing while others will not. Self-enforcing functions presuppose that there will be an alignment between the institutional powers and the self-interest of officials holding that position of powers to advance that given function and to enforce that norm. An example will be majoritarian rule, again, in that relatively functional democracy, which of course already presumes a lot. But in that context, you may assume that political officials will have an incentive to advance a policy agenda, while at the same time, at least looking as if they were advancing and protecting the interests of a majority of their constituency to improve their chances of being re-elected. A similar argument may be seen in the Federalists, with the idea that the system of checks and balances will be sustained over time by aligning the institutional powers and the incentives of officials to prevent the encroachment of one branch of government on the other. In this context, some functions will be left to one side because those functions will not be self-enforcing. So by the same coin of the argument that I was making about majority rule, for example, the protection of minority may be non-self-enforcing. The maintenance of a stable monetary policy or the management of elections that you wouldn't like to leave on the hands of the party in power to organize, because of course you will presume it will have an interest to tilt the field on its own favor. So what can we do? There's the proposal that you can allocate those functions to an independent institution according to the guarantor model. In that regard, the guarantor model can be interpreted as a means to provide a credible commitment to a function that none of the three traditional branches, as they are composed, has simultaneously the incentives, capacity, and knowledge to perform adequately. Thus understood, the guarantor model is generally characterized by some features such as an aspiration of operating above party politics and then reaching some degree of partisan insulation. These institutions aspire to have also a operational independence, which is linked with the last point of trust type delegation, which in short is a way to distinguish the type of delegation that these institutions have from the delegation that characterizes an agency, while principal-agent relationship is characterized by the idea that the agent must advance the will of a principal and remain faithful to the will of the principal. A trustee, on the other hand, must advance and protect an interest regardless of the will of the principal over time. So even if the principal changes, and concretely this means even if the political system changes its mind regarding what is the best course of action, the trustee, the guarantor, must remain faithful to the protection of that interest and not of advancing the will of the political system. Other features are the officials in the guarantor model are unelected appointees instead of elected officials. They tend to enjoy tenure protections and sometimes secure budget, among other features. And so now going back to the idea of a puzzle, if all that has been said makes any sense, you will have a puzzle, as I was saying, regarding first, why will these organized groups in control of the political branches will have an interest in relinquishing a power that they currently have and allocating it into an independent institution. And second, once the institution is in place, why they will respect its decisions and its independence. A few answers have been provided by the literature from the point of view of scholarship, starting from the rational choice framework. And at the level of creation, you have some answers. These are particularly developed in regard to constitutional courts and the independence of judicial review. So it's something that I believe may be applied more broadly to a framework of what I call the guarantor model. So this is, of course, something that I would really like to hear your thoughts if you think that it may be applicable to other types of institutions, which I believe to be the case, or you disagree. So in principle, you would expect that these organized groups will have an interest in creating these institutions and allocating these functions based on an aspiration of hegemonic preservation, or, for example, as a matter of insurance. And from the point of view of insurance, which I think may capture a significant part of this, what matters is that these parties foresee that in the near future may be outside of power, so they may prefer allocating that power into an independent institution instead of leaving that in the hands of their opponents that again, they foresee maybe gain power in the next round of the political game. During there, a point that I don't mention here, but I think it's also relevant, has to do with the possibility that this powerful interest may foresee of seizing some benefits of providing a credible commitment to sticking to a given promise over time. So they may also have an incentive to that regard to allocate this given function to an independent institution instead of maintaining it within the political game. And during the existence of this institution, the argument is similar. Presumably, the party in government will have an incentive to maintain an institution, either because it sees a benefit in the maintenance of these institutions, or alternatively, but related, may see that it is comparatively costly to challenge or attempt to capture the institution. So the underlying argument will be that if this is the case, it is possible, in principle, that these institutions are superfluous, because all what I've been saying so far is that for these institutions to operate, you have to have a competitive political system where parties see a benefit of maintaining the independence of these institutions, or alternatively may fear a punishment and the possibility of being outside of government in a following round. So that may be closer to Tashnet's argument. So what I'm trying to present in what follows is what will be the conditions that would allow this guarantor game to exist. I call the guarantor game to the nested game that is linked and that operates within the game of politics, but if it acquires some degree of autonomy, may maintain itself over time, even if the original conditions that led to the creation of the guarantor may change within certain parameters. Again, this is a nested game within the game of politics, so it does not operate outside of it. It still requires some degree of competitiveness within the game of politics, but may increase the parameters where the institution is self-enforcing, and I will try to explain this in what follows. In a pre-guarantor game of politics, what you will have is that the party in government may face a decision of either pursuing a desired outcome and risking punishment from the other side of the opposition and stakeholders, or deciding otherwise and avoiding the risk of punishment. So punishment will depend on whether the political environment, as I was saying, is sufficiently competitive, and if the opposition is successful in persuading the broader population of the inconvenience of the course of action that is being taken by the party in government. And I think this is different from that suggests that a different set of alternatives, and which means different strategies and different payoffs for the party in government in deciding its own course of action. Once you have a guarantor in place, the alternatives will be abiding by the guarantor or respecting its independence, challenging it, as I was saying, or attempting to capture the guarantor. And again, the critical factor is the parties' belief on the possibilities of either seizing a benefit from its existence or the fear of an eventual punishment. So what may change by having a guarantor? What may be different? And I tend to think that there will be some differences that are mentioned at the end of the slide, which are the salience of the issue. Now, you may expect that the opposition is not only arguing about the inconvenience of the course of action of the party in government, but also about the illegality or eventually unconstitutionality of what the government is doing that will increase the probabilities of punishment. The guarantor model will presumably extend the time horizons of the different players by making more difficult the task of obtaining the desired outcome in just one round of the game, or eventually successfully capturing the decision maker that is the guarantor. And this is extremely significant when it comes to the possibility of punishment, because punishment depends on whether opposition is able to solve a collective action problem of coordinating different stakeholders and coordinating the population by persuading them that the party in government deserves a punishment by the course of action that is taking. And all of this doesn't do away with the fact that the guarantor must still be self-enforcing, but opens the possibility that it may also be self-reinforcing. And that's, I think, the critical issue. What does self-reinforceability mean? Well, as I was saying, the guarantor game is nested in the game of politics. So the guarantor must still be self-enforcing in the game of politics. If the guarantor games acquire some degree of autonomy, it may eventually be self-reinforcing. Self-reinforceability means, in short, that the behavior and the processes that the guarantor's game entail will have an impact on what some authors have called quasi-parameters, and through that increase the range of parameters that concretely means the situations where the institution is self-enforcing. So this means, in short, that by the very behavior of the institution is able to build a state of affairs where even if the competitiveness of the original cleavage that led to its creation decreases, the institution may still find support from different stakeholders, maybe from a different cleavage, and adapt itself to changes in the circumstances that may maintain it as self-enforcing over time. For that to be the case, the institution requires some degree of autonomy and the capacity to act strategically, to move in the changing environment of the game of politics. So at exogenous level, it means that the institution must remain self-enforcing in the game of politics. But at an endogenous level, it means that the guarantor games must be self-reinforcing, as I was saying. So the claim is that the guarantor model makes sense. The guarantor is able to guarantee something when the endogenous conditions acquire some degree of autonomy from the exogenous factors, and that autonomy is self-reinforcing over time. And with this, I am approaching the end of the presentation. So what I have observed so far, and again, this is open to your comments and your observations, is that there are at least 3 different levels where this may be analyzed in the ground. First is the fact that not every function can be allocated according to the guarantor model, because not every function can be self-enforcing over time. To begin with, you need a competitive cleavage of interested parties in the maintenance of this independent institution. The institution cannot be seen as just another player in the game of party politics, as advancing a policy agenda, because if that is the case, then you would expect that one of the parties will make its case part of its own agenda the elimination of the institution. An example will be that if you have, for example, an institution protecting the environment, that institution will be self-enforcing only insofar the main political cleavage accepts that the protection of the environment is something important, even if they disagree regarding how to carry out the protection of the environment. So they may prefer to respect the decisions of the independent institution instead of challenging it. But if you have a party in the cleavage that thinks that climate change is a hoax, you will assume that that party has no incentive whatsoever to maintain the institution and may assume as part of its campaign the destruction of that institution. So I will say that when you allocate a function according to the guarantor model, you require to have some degree of competitive cleavage, not only at the time of the creation, but also the expectation of that competitiveness over time. And that is also relevant because you need sufficiently powerful stakeholders to protect the institution in question, because as an unelected institution, it is unlikely that it will be able to command a constituency, right? So that would be the first point, the question regarding what are the stakeholders of a given function, who are the interested parties in that competitive cleavage that will be able to maintain its self-enforceability over time. The institutional design is also part of the problem, because the credibility of the institution as an actor that is not merely a partisan actor is also played at the level of institutional design. The institutional design must aspire to guarantee independence and show some degree of expertise. This means that the institution must look as doing something that is justifiable as not merely an exercise of will, but also an exercise of an special knowledge. And I think probably the case of when we talk about expert institution is easier, but also you can see it regarding courts. Either because if a court look as if it's just disregarding the justification of its decision as a matter of law and engaging directly into politics, then also it's unlikely that it will remain self-enforcing over time, because again, that will erase the distinction between the game of politics and the guarantor game, as I was saying previously. And finally, the behavior of the institution itself must aspire to be self-reinforcing. And this is what I meant when I was saying that the institution must balance these two registers of its own activity. The institution is indeed exercising an activity where it's justifying its decisions as doing a technical task, either in the legal field, either in the economic field or whatever, but at the same time acting strategically and remaining within that competitive cleavage, preventing the eventual alienation of one side of the political cleavage, or alienating the powerful stakeholders that may support the institution to operate against the tides of partisan politics. Because now, to close and to connect this with what I was saying at the beginning, if we are creating these institutions to realize a non-self-enforcing norm, then there's a lot at stake in answering the question of how these institutions are able to build support over time, assuming that they may not have the support of the party in government at the critical moment when we expect them to operate and be effective. So that's basically the presentation. As I was saying, this is the basic theoretical framework that I am thinking about using to later operate with to approach a more empirical / comparative exam of Latin American guarantors. So yeah, that's basically it. I appreciate your time and attention, and I very much looking forward to your comments.
Well, thanks a lot, Hernán. That was very interesting. So Marcus, now over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Leonid, and thank you, Hernán, for this very interesting presentation. First of all, thanks to Norman for putting this together, getting us here. It's always a pleasure to be here in the GlobalSouth network. First of all, you clearly have a project that is a very interesting idea to pursue during a PhD. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to throw at you 3 problems that I found with your presentation here today, and hope that it may help you to develop in answering or responding, if you wish to, it might help you develop your thesis. So first of all, when I'm puzzled by which kinds of institution you're talking about, because you seem to propose like a generic model that could encompass several different kinds of institutions that can be considered, can fall under your Guarantor'S definition. And these institutions that I will just briefly, make an example here, they could be in, the executive power, the legislative power, or even in the judiciary, right? And they could still be guarantors under the 3 branches. So under this guarantor idea, I could say like the Flight Regulation Agency could be a guarantor, which is completely different from the central bank, which is clearly a guarantor, and the Federal Prosecution Service, which in many countries is independent even from the judiciary, right? Cannot be nominated. So I think the way you use the term right now is still too generic. Because the second thing that came to my mind is that, aren't you talking about, does this definition apply to the judiciary per se? Because a lot of what you said would apply for the judiciary, and because they have the very same issues that you pointed out in your presentation. The question that you opened with this question, who guarantees the guarantor? That was a question that was asked in 1905. By the Brazilian president, who was a dictatorship, like a field marshal from the Brazilian army, who asked that question to the Supreme Justices. He said, he had arrested the Navy admirals, and then these guys were getting habeas corpus granted by the Supreme Court. And then he asked this question: who will grant habeas corpus to the Supreme Justices? So when I arrested. So this is a very old question that has been thrown to the judiciary. And that's my first question too. Like, aren't you talking about, is this a judiciary, or does it apply for these regulator agencies and administrative agencies that could be under the executive, for example? How can you actually fit them all into the same model? In my opinion, that I'm not saying you cannot do it. I'm just saying that right now it's not clear. The second thing that I wanted to say is, you talk about the model, but when you talk about the model, it's not clear to me, but it seems you're taking a functionalist approach to this problem, right? So you're talking about function, design, behavior, but then I would urge you to consider some other, realistic, some realism or pragmatism, or even some critical theory, to get on board with that, because you could also focus on, how are people selected to be part of these institutions. Who are these people? Or, do they have gender, class, race? Does that make a difference in their role when they are operating? So I think that those are subtle questions, but they make a difference, like in if they are actually guarantor, if they can be, non-self-enforcing, who can be non-self-enforcing in the way that you actually mentioned. On top of that, you could also focus on the results. Do they actually give good results? And do the results they deliver improve their legitimacy, for example? You didn't talk about legitimacy much. You talked about if they're accepted by the parties, right? By the different parties, punishment. That is kind of, you're looking at not at the results they deliver, but how they act once they are out, for example, or once they have taken a decision. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, I actually wanted to give an example and hear from you if you have looked into examples other than the one I'm going to mention. So there was in Brazil, you have these institutions, most of them guarantor, institutions that could fit into the of course, aside the judiciary obviously can fit, but you have institutions like that named in the Constitution, right? So they're there. You cannot take them out because they're already there. One of them is the federal prosecution, Ministério Público Federal. The federal prosecution is completely independent from the judiciary, from the executive and from the legislative, to a point that people have suggested, no one has the guts to actually propose it, but that we have 4 branches of powers in Brazil, right? No one has actually made that, but it's almost like that. And the biggest electoral problems that we faced, and which are still going on right now, were caused by them, right? In 2018, the Car Wash Task Force prosecuted a number of politicians, and once they were, sentenced by a higher court, they were uneligible, right? They could not run for elections. That was why Lula could not run for 2018, and Bolsonaro was elected. And then what happened? Just after that election, the main prosecutor from the case, he ran away from the institution. He renounced his position in the institution, people suggest afraid of the consequences of what he had done, and then he became a politician. He went to become a member of the legislative, which was like unprecedented. And the other guy, the federal judge, became the Minister of Justice of Bolsonaro and later became a senator. So all, the 2 biggest figures involved in that, which was started as a technical procedure, became heavily political, right? And still suffered the consequences of what they did, because the first guy I mentioned was removed from office by the very representative. The representatives voted him out. Thank you, Hernán, for this interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the Brazilian perspective, by the way. It's very much similar to other cases as well, cases of Latin America. And I think Hernán would find similarities in Chile as well. But before we go into the details, can we go to who is next?
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, firstly, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Hernán, for that presentation, which is very interesting and thought-provoking. I will restrict myself to one question that I was thinking about throughout, and I'll elaborate on it a little bit. So, because you want to sort of move the emphasis a little bit towards looking at the games that these different institutional entities are playing, and how having guarantor institutions, how they might realistically perform their function is by altering the logic of the games in some ways. And then you also mentioned that because you focus on this game and this idea of the equilibrium, you say that not all norms, for example, can effectively be enforced by guarantor institutions. Somewhere else, I think it's in your abstract, you mentioned that therefore you're also not looking at guarantor institutions as a unit necessarily, but more as a network, and that makes sense, of course. And one more point I'll say is that you mentioned that on the partisan point, you doubt that there is a kind of Kelsenian supra non-partisan place from which these institutions can function. So all of this means that everything that they do when analyzing whether they're performing their function is very context specific. It very much will have to look at all the behaviors and so on, which is interesting. But what I was trying to understand was, and similar to the previous discussant, because you have this heterogeneity among different kinds of guarantor institutions, I was trying to understand that if you are going for this network kind of conception, would you also see the enforcement of individual norms in this dispersed kind of sense? Would you say, for example, that like almost like a kind of systemic conception, wherein could you say that a particular guarantor institution, in the choice that they make whether to intervene or not, would you say that perhaps non-intervention is more justified if you look at the network or the system as a whole? And these games are complicated and multi-level, particularly in federal systems that I'm interested in. And you could also have guarantor institutions functioning at different levels simultaneously. But then I guess my concern is that if we disperse it to this extent, then how do we analyze this? Like, you know, it would be like if we were to restrict it relatively simplistically to just say, here's a guarantor institution, this is what it's supposed to do. If it's not doing it, it's not doing its function. Like that's a very it's a simplistic way of looking at it, which does leave out a lot. And I think you're moving away from that, which has its benefits. But then my concern would be, how do we then distinguish whether a particular instance of non-intervention, let's say, is on this network systemic conception actually good for the norm, holistically speaking, versus not. So I was interested to hear your thoughts on how this kind of fragmentation might work. Similarly, on the federal systems point, just very quickly, I mean, I'm most familiar with India, and in India, for example, you have the Election Commission, which also Tarun Khaitan talks about a lot. And the Election Commission is a very vertically integrated kind of institution. You do have election commissioners at state level itself, but it's very top down. And in that sense, it's very unlike the other branches, I suppose, except for the judiciary, of course. So, I mean, that's like almost another level of complexity to this game kind of thing. So I'm just interested to know, what analytical criteria would you have to say that, you know, a particular unit, even though, yes, you should see a unit in a context, but how do I analyze a unit within this systemic conception? I would be interested to know. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Hernán. That was, yeah, a very interesting presentation. I think a lot of the things that occurred to me while listening were sort of relate to what maybe Marcus brought up as well. So thoughts about what exactly does this guarantor model encapsulate? Maybe thinking more about the specific criteria to kind of distinguish between those different bodies and institutions that this encapsulates. And I did notice that you did have a kind of list of some criteria in there. But yeah, I think relating back to what's already been said as well is, you know, from those things you identified, does that necessarily kind of distinguish institutions beyond those three existing branches? You know, I'm kind of thinking about how these things necessarily exist as a fourth branch, particularly like a constitutional court, which I know you kind of highlighted as maybe being a controversial thing to identify as that. And I don't know if that's, you know, thinking of a constitutional court as tying into this guarantor model, whether that's just sort of your own part of your own conception, or if it's kind of relates to the wider literature in the area as well. So I'd be interested to know maybe if you have any more thoughts about, you know, why a constitutional court would kind of fall into this, when, you know, and why not just kind of look at that through the lens of, you know, the constitutional function of the judicial branch, for example. Why distinguish it in this way? And I suppose relating to that as well, one thing I did notice from your list of criteria was you highlighted, I think, constitutional entrenchment as one of the things that would distinguish an institution as being part of this guarantor model. So yeah, I think I was just interested to maybe know more about why entrenchment is, you know, one of the things that would highlight an institution as being part of this. How exactly are you understanding entrenchment in this context? Because it is quite a broad term and it can be understood in a lot of different ways. And also thinking about entrenchment as well, I was thinking about how that maybe ties back to your, you know, the two aspects of the guarantor puzzle that you brought up. So why do political actors, if I'm remembering this correctly, why do political actors maintain these institutions? But if they're defined based upon being sort of constitutionally entrenched, does that not in itself kind of give a strong reason as to why political actors maintain those? Assuming, you know, I'm thinking of constitutional entrenchment in terms of, you know, mechanisms that would protect these things from the scope of kind of ordinary politics and ordinary political disagreements. So I don't know how, you know, that kind of relates to stuff. But yeah, those are sort of the main thoughts I had. Another question that, you know, maybe if there's time, you could maybe talk a little bit about. But another thought I had was, this might be a little bit early as well for you. You're still kind of working out the framework. But it looks like, you know, you're wanting to delve into the dynamics of political practice and the relationship between political actors and these institutions. And, you know, I know from some of my own work and some of the things I've been trying to do that it can be quite difficult to kind of investigate these political dynamics. They can be really complex. And I know you mentioned at some point maybe taking an empirical approach. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are about how you would apply this as a framework once you've kind of worked it all out. Yeah, and what kind of, yeah, what your methods would be, I suppose, how you're looking to sort of apply this. But yeah, very interesting presentation overall. And thank you for Norman for inviting me to be a part of this. So it was very, very interesting.
Thanks a lot, Harry. I'm just conscious of time, so trying to move things along. Hernán, a few minutes. I suspect you're not going to be able to answer everything, so please don't be mad at Hernán, because that's not going to happen. I don't think. We've had a number of very interesting questions and comments, but take perhaps 4 or 5 minutes. And meanwhile, if others want to raise their hand, I will. That will leave maybe a couple more minutes after Hernán has finished to take questions from the audience. Hernán, you over to you.
Well, thank you so much for your questions, and I really appreciate them, because I think you were able to spot probably, and I will start with this, probably the point that has caused me more problems, which has to do with the distinction between these institutions and the judiciary, because a lot of times I've been thinking, this maybe is more something that may be predicable of every unelected institution, and at some degree of every possible institution. It's just that some institutions are more transparent than others regarding its own conditions of possibility. So what I'm saying is, if the unelected institution, the guarantor, does not have support, it is very likely that it will be either challenged or captured, eliminated, whatever. That is true of the political branches too. We have seen it. It's true of political parties. It's just that those institutions are conceptually made to transmit the interests that are somewhere else. So you would assume that a political party will die if it's unable to represent the interests of people on the ground. So yeah, it is a very significant point, and I am honestly still struggling to solve that issue. So I have no answer for that yet. regarding the approach, I will answer now one question of each, so I don't take all the time. But regarding the functional approach, yeah, it seems that I am taking a functionalist approach. And why I am not speaking of legitimacy, I am mostly using the language of political economy, and I am consciously avoiding the language of legitimacy because that opens a lot of other difficult questions, like what's the distinction between legitimacy and perceived legitimacy? How do I make sense precisely of cases that where you have an institution that is clearly going beyond its mandate or maybe not acting according to its mandate, and this is related to the question that Kevin was suggesting, but yet we praise the institution for acting in the way it's doing it. If that is the case, then maybe the better framework is one of political economy that precedes of the language of legitimacy, but that was a conscious decision of not using it, at least yet. I am aware that at some point I will face some problems regarding democratic theory and the link between democratic legitimacy and these institutions, and then maybe the use of the language of legitimacy will be unavoidable. We will see. The question that Kevin was suggesting, yeah, I think that's a very clever point. How do you distinguish some sort of strategic passiveness, some sort of aware an activity versus saying that the institution is just not discharging the function that is supposed to fulfill? And yes, I think it has to do with what I was saying in the language of political economy. You will say that the institution is actually doing what it takes to survive, and if the institution made a bad bargain, a bad calculus regarding its own conditions of possibility and decided not to act, then presumably it will lose some support, and that may weaken its own position within this network of institutions. So that may generate some degree of competitiveness between different institutions. So you may see a federal prosecutor that really wants to stand out by doing what it's doing, and it's deciding if that's a good bet or not, and it may backfire. That's something that it's hard to predicate at the moment the institution is making the decision whether to act or not, and in general, it's something that you may only predicate in hindsight, which is very convenient when you do the comparative study of things that already happened a few years ago, and you can say, oh, look, this is something that went wrong, but it's very hard to tell when things are unfolding. So yeah, it's convenient for the academic, but not for the official. So that may be an unfair assessment, I will say. But in principle, I would say that will be a good criterion, whether the institution self-undermines its own position or is strengthening its own position in this network. And lastly, I mentioned the difficulties distinguishing between this and the judicial branch. But yes, I think the position to identify what institutions fall within this category, probably the degree of independence, of operational independence, is the critical factor, because it is linked to all the other factors. As I was saying, the institution operating as a trustee instead of operating as an agency, and and this is linked also with what you were mentioning, Harry, regarding constitutional entrenchment. Yes, constitutional entrenchment is significant insofar it makes more costly for the political actors to challenge and to capture the institution. But it's linked to that, to maintain the independence of the institution. And if the institutional design and all the features that I mentioned are successful in generating that independence, then that does not guarantee that the institution will act independently. You may have a very good design, but still the institution be subservient to the interests of the governing party. But it opens the door, it opens the possibility of the institution operating in what I was suggesting to characterize as a self-reinforcing manner over time. So yeah, thank you so much for your comments and for your attention to the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Hernán. We're pretty much out of time. Thanks to everyone for the discussion. Great questions and lots for us to think about. So the just concluding message about the GlobalSouth network is that the network warmly welcomes PhD students from all disciplines and every corner of the world to share their research and receive feedback. I think we've had a great advertisement for that today. If you're interested in presenting your work, please contact Dr. Nauman Riyad, who is the convener and founder. He's sharing his email address, so that's where you find him. Next week, same time, we are joined by Ayesha Umanya Tayut, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell, and will be presenting on the international criminal law and democratization of international human rights law. So that is October 29, same time, wherever you are in the world. Thanks a lot for being here, and have a good day.
Thank you, Leonid, for excellently chairing the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.